Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy Podcast. My name is Jacqueline Beckoff, and with me, as always, is Arianne Lockra. We both own successful music studios in Southern California, and I also own Defined Music Teacher. How are things for you this week, Arianne?
Hey, things are good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I just enjoyed a week off after my studio recital. I celebrated my birthday. I also I successfully completed my audition. For those of you following along, I successfully completed my graduate audition, and I have been invited to join the program at California State University at Fullerton.
Yay. Oh my gosh. Is it are you planning for the year ahead
Fall. I'm planning to
already?
start in fall semester, which is 5 months away, 4 months away.
So you have some time.
Yes, time to enjoy life as a free woman before I'm back in the bondage of music school.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's going to be an adjustment with your schedule and everything, but I mean, I think it's going to be totally worth it.
yeah, I'm excited for it. I'm excited for it. It's gonna be it's gonna be a crucible. Nothing like music school to shape an artist and just develop like crazy in a relatively short amount of time. I learned
Yeah.
more in 3 years my undergrad than I did in the preceding 17 years of piano lessons.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be more well-rounded and it's going to give you just a really good perspective on things outside your usual. Um, and then also the piano instruction is going to be top notch. So I'm so excited for you. Congrats. I mean, I knew it was going to happen, but yeah.
Yeah, and I applied to the school. I was waiting for the audition to see if I was going to actually apply to the school itself, but I did go ahead and actually apply. So it's official. We'll see. Um, but our topic this week, for those of you who heard us last time, I had a particularly spicy opinion about counting, and I said we weren't going to go down our tangent, then we were going to have to leave that discussion for another day. But today we're going to talk about rhythm and counting and all of that nitty gritty details. For those of you that that haven't listened to the previous episode, I don't know why you wouldn't have, but for those of you who haven't listened to the episode, my spicy opinion is that I don't allow my students to subdivide eighth notes. And the more in depth is that I teach my students two forms of counting. I teach them detailed counting, which is subdividing every beat, and then beat counting, which has no subdivision of any kind. And I don't allow students to mix the two. So, for example, I wouldn't allow a student to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. I wouldn't allow a student to do that. They would either have to do 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 or 1, 2, 3, 4. They can't mix the two of them. So that was the conversation from our last episode that we're now following up on.
And what are the reasons for this approach for you?
So, rhythm in general was one of my weakest points coming in to my undergrad and just throughout my piano lessons as a child and a young adult. Rhythm has always been my my weakest point, and I strive for the same for the things that were weaknesses for me as a student. I try my best to make those things be strengths for my students. I try to have everything be well-rounded and strengths, but especially for the things that I struggled with, like memorization. I have a big focus on memorization because memorization was terrifying to me as a child, and I felt like I was just awful at it. So I have a big emphasis on that. But the reason behind my approach has to do with the fact that when a student becomes over-reliant on subdivision, they are essentially changing the time signature of their piece. They are essentially changing the time signature of
What?
the piece. Yes. So if a student is in 4/4 and there's eighth notes, and they are just having the hardest time with their eighth notes. There's eighth notes in a lot of the different measures, but there's half notes and other rhythms as well. So if they're counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and in every single measure, so that they make sure that they can get their whole notes not to be rushed, right? Because I mean, that's a big thing. If they have a bunch of eighth notes leading into a whole note, oftentimes the whole note will go twice as fast. Has that happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
So if instead of finding another alternative, if they're subdividing a whole note into 8 parts, right? They're no longer feeling 4 beats in a measure. They're feeling 8 beats in a measure. There should essentially be counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Because if they're counting every measure, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and they are just, those eighth notes are getting so clunky and heavy, and they have no idea what that big beat feels like because they're become so reliant on the subdivision.
Okay, well, let me counter with this. In cases, except cases of syncopation, which, if the student is just learning eighth notes, I'm not sure why they would already be on syncopation. So let's just assume there's no syncopation. Wouldn't it just suffice to teach a student who's doing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that and is kind of generally seen as a weaker beat than the number?
Yeah, I mean, the the numbers, of course, are the stronger beats. But I feel like if a student is so lost that they have defaulted back to subdividing everything, they've defaulted back to subdividing everything. And I mean, I recall when I was a kid, I would have a bunch of eighth notes leading into a long note, and then I would just subdivide that long note to make sure um, that I didn't rush the long note, right? And I don't think that at that point I was really concerned with if the ands were strong or if they were weak. I was just desperately trying to make sure that the whole note didn't get rushed, right? So the solution that my teacher gave me was, okay, well, you're keeping track of your eighth notes because you have to, because they're there. You have lots of eighth notes. So it's not like you're going to mess up the eighth notes in this rhythmic context. So instead of that, let's just subdivide the whole note. You're already keeping track of eighth notes. You already know how the eighth notes feel. So let's just extend that to the whole note. But the flip side of that is the problem isn't in the whole note. The problem is that you lose the big beat. You lose the big beat in the eighth notes that you stop feeling in your body. They don't know where the strong beats are. If they knew where the strong beats are, they wouldn't be losing the beats for the whole note.
Okay. So between the two things that you outlined that you would use, which is either, saying 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and all the time, or not saying the ands at all and just going with the numbers, but still clapping out the correct rhythm in both cases. Do you have a preference?
So detailed counting, subdividing, and beat counting, no subdivision. The preference and the counting that my students overwhelmingly use is beat counting. Most of my students do not need to subdivide the beat in order to understand their eighth note rhythms. So they can sight read music that has eighth notes in it without having to use ands and without losing the big beats on stuff like whole notes. So my preference is overwhelmingly for beat counting. Absolutely. In fact, I just started preparing a student for eighth notes yesterday, actually. And I taught her about beat counting because she was a transfer student, not a transfer student. She's coming back to music as an adult after not doing music for like 40 years. And so she's aware of eighth notes. She vaguely knows the concept of ands. So we have to address it. And I said, ands are a practice tool to help us understand our rhythms. They are not a long-term solution. If you're struggling to understand a rhythm, we can pull out detailed counting. We can tap it, we can clap it, and then before you go back to whatever you were doing before you started using that detailed counting, get that section back to beat counting before you move on, right? Don't leave a section on detailed counting because that's just going to breed that lack of big beat. This is like a big picture thing rather than it's a process rather than results focused, I guess. Because the subdividing gets you to the right answer, right? They're going to hold the whole note for the right number of beats, but the way they get there doesn't really resolve the problem.
Got it. Okay. Well, getting to kind of more complex rhythms, what would you do if you're teaching like a 2 against 3 polyrhythm?
Polyrhythms, I mean, polyrhythms are not something that I have a great deal of experience teaching. I've only taught polyrhythms a handful of times, but there are do you know the not difficult? Do you know that?
Yeah, actually, someone taught me not very hard, not very hard.
Yeah, so there's the saying that helps feel that, but um, polyrhythms they tend to feel very mechanical when someone is relying on that kind of method to understand where to put the notes, right? Polyrhythms are at their best when it feels like you have two different people playing. One person's playing a triplet and one person's playing an eighth note, and they are not even. I don't say they're not listening to each other, but they're completely independent of one another, right? That's when a polyrhythm really feels good when when the student isn't focused on where do I place this triplet compared to this eighth note and not mathematical, but just kind of they're fluent in it, they're feeling it, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm gonna kind of go off on a small tangent here, but it's totally related, I promise. Um, do you know Yanni and Laurel? That whole thing that went down, like when there was this viral sound clip that was, circulating on social media where this dude was saying Yanni, or and some people would
And
hear
depending on the
Yanni.
text, you could either hear Yanni or Laurel if what you were
Yeah.
reading. Yeah.
That's how it feels when it comes to learning about polyrhythms for me. Sometimes it really helps to hear the streamlined version as if, basically what I mean is as if it were one voice that happened to be hitting all of those precise marks that both the eighth notes and the triplets hit at once. And then from there, it helps me to separate it out, like mentally or physically with two different hands or something like that. Um, so it goes back and forth for me between Yanni and Laurel, so to speak.
So you're saying that you can focus on the triplet and hear the triplet, or focus on the eighth note and hear the eighth note.
Um,
Is that what I'm understanding?
I guess no, what I'm trying to say is that I can focus on the rhythm as if it were all the same
Oh, okay.
instrument doing it. And then from there, mentally, I can separate it out. But in my experience with students, it doesn't always work that way. So I usually resort to some kind of partner activity where they tap eighth notes with a metronome, and then I come in with triplets. And once they get that in their ear and they hear the two different voices, then I'll allow them to take over my part after some time and see if they can do it the same way, if they could replicate the sounds that both of us were making independently, just on their own.
Do you do they come back the next week with it correct in your experience? The first week after you introduce a polyrhythm to a student, do they bring it back correct? Because they don't bring it back correct for me.
Sometimes it really just depends on the student, but it's not easy teaching polyrhythms a lot of the time, and it's not easy learning them either. So, I guess if they understand the theory behind it and they get the approach and you lay it out visually, and maybe if they've done fractions in math class, that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, you can split it up into like for 3 against 2, you can split it up into what, 6 parts? Six parts, and then chart it on graph paper. And instead of counting, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Have you done that?
No, actually, I haven't. Can you say more about that?
So you would split like 3 against 2. Let me make sure that I'm doing no 3. It has to be 12. It has to be 12. So
Yeah, that's what I was
it has to be
thinking.
12, not 6.
Right.
So you'd have an eighth note on 1 and 7, and then 1 for. Oh wait, yeah, 1 for 9 and no, yeah, 1 4 9, 1 4 and 9 for the triplet. So then you would be able to understand. But that's I feel like that approach. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally.
That approach is so micro, right? That is such a micro approach that it is so difficult for me to speed that up to the point where you're fitting, because you're now, I mean, back to subdividing, you're subdividing a beat into 12 parts, right? To understand a polyrhythm, you're subdividing a beat into 12 parts. And obviously that's not sustainable. You have to get back to that. Well, you have to get back to beat counting. You have to get back to understanding how all 5 of those notes for 3 versus 2 fit together into one beat. So I feel like that approach, actually, I suppose that kind of lines up with how I approach eighth notes and triplets by themselves. Understanding on a very focused scale how the rhythm fits together, and then bringing it back to the macro scale of just understanding on the beats. But polyrhythms are something I have not had a great deal of success with, and I think part of that is that I've only had one student that I've ever taught polyrhythms to. I've only had one student reach the point where we're doing polyrhythms. I have another student that is gearing up to I'm going to try to introduce a polyrhythm for the first time, because she brought in some music that she was interested in for band. Her band teacher doesn't play the piano. Her orchestra teacher doesn't play the piano. So sometimes he gives her this stuff without really realizing the sheer difficulty of what he's just given her. And this had 5 against 4 and 3 against 2 and 3 against 4 in it. And we've never done any polyrhythms together. So the Chopin E minor prelude, are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
I've used that with my other student as the first exposure to polyrhythms. Because it has 3 against 2, it just has it once in the whole piece. And it's that was good, but it took weeks for her to bring it back and bring it back perfect. I will not sugarcoat that. I feel like this is one of my weakest areas, not only as a performer with polyrhythms. I'm very uncomfortable with polyrhythms. If I went over there to the piano, I wouldn't be able to do a 3 against 4 right on my first try, or a 5 against 4 on my first try. I know you don't have a piano near you. Are you fluent in polyrhythms? Would you be able to pull out a 3 versus 4 scale?
I've tried it, and 3 against 4 is tougher. But I was thinking just now about a potential little memory trick. I think it was, hang on, let me think about it for a second. It involved the words, "I am a piano god."
I am a piano god?
Yeah, so I am a piano god. I am a piano god, like that. So, is that 3 against?
I don't know, that just sounds like quarter notes to me. I am piano. Piano is a triple. I am I don't know the way.
No, so
I guess
piano, like the 2-syllable pronunciation of piano.
piano.
But then listen to my fingers. If you can hear me snapping, I am.
We can't hear your snapping.
Oh,
Yeah. Zoom is filtering that out for us.
oh, okay. So let me kind of try to visually do it. See here? Whenever I join my fingers, that's the other voice doing the beat. I am a piano god. So I could do it, but it would take me some time and I would have to go slow at first and then maybe like bump it up.
Yeah, I think that polyrhythms are relatively rare. So we struggle even as performers, as college educated performers. We struggle perhaps to reach generalization stage with polyrhythms that where we can just see them and be fluent in them. And I don't want to subject myself to this. So hopefully my piano teacher is not listening. But an etude, a polyrhythm etude, where you just bang your head against the wall for like an entire college semester, and then at the end of it, you're like, okay, I understand. I understand polyrhythms now. I wonder what it would take for us to be able to teach our students to be completely comfortable with polyrhythms.
Um, I find that whenever there's a difficult rhythm situation, I like to lean heavily on all three modes of learning, the tactile, kinesthetic, visual, and auditory, and make sure that I have hit all three just so that it's totally foolproof and whatever category someone fits into when it comes to learning their rhythms, they're more or less covered. So I always like to draw like rectangles on a piece of paper that are sectioned off accordingly so they have that visual cue. I like to allow them to go on YouTube and play as many recordings as many times as they need to of the repertoire that they're learning. And then I always like to do like tapping exercises on the closed keyboard lid with both hands if possible, kind of what I was describing before in the form of a partner exercise. Just guided learning about the theoretical side of it, and then putting it into practice. I find that if I just model the repertoire enough in the section that contains the polyrhythm, usually kids catch on. I also have a very auditory based like curriculum in general. So I don't know if that helps or
I mean, it's definitely good. I think that I focus primarily on the auditory aspect and tapping. I get them to I have my students tap it. But visually understanding, perhaps subdividing it into the 12 parts, or as another visual activity, it would be beneficial for the student, and perhaps learning it outside of their repertoire with a scale. For example, I think if you do I think if you do a 5-finger scale in the left hand and you do a full octave scale in the right hand, they'll end up back on tonic if if one hand does triplets and one hand does eighth notes. Or it might need to be a 2-octave scale versus a 5-finger scale. But one of those two,
sorry, are we back to 3 against 2 in this scenario?
yes, sorry, this is 3
okay.
against 2. Against 2, I'm pretty sure, because you need 3 notes for every 2 notes. 16 versus, I don't know.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so that's
if you reach the octave, the next C higher, let's say you're doing a C scale in your right hand, then you'll be on the G in your left hand.
Also, you can do a 3-octave scale in your right hand with triplets and the 2-octave scale in your left hand with eighth notes, and that should also line up because it's three octaves versus 2 octaves. It should end up back on tonic. So I would be really interested to learn how other people teach polyrhythms, because I've only ever done it once. I've only ever had one student advanced enough to that point. She's an adult student, but I have some younger students in the wings where I feel like they're going to be at polyrhythms, in the near future. And I've only really taught it the way I was taught it, which is, modeling it, tapping it, the rhythmic sayings, like not very hard or not difficult. And then one of the other ones that I do is I have them shadow play. Shadow play is something that I've mentioned on this podcast before. Playing one hand so softly that it doesn't make a sound. Shadow play one hand and then play the other hand so that you can hear that triplet or hear that eighth note while still getting the experience of in your other hand playing the opposing rhythm. But I feel like when I have when I've had more opportunities to teach it, I will be better at it. But I wonder if polyrhythms is perhaps one of the most difficult things to teach for us as pianists. It's also exclusive to pianists and other keyboard instruments. Would that be an accurate statement?
Oh yeah, I think it's right up there for me personally. In my experience, it's right up there with like teaching staff notation and note identification on the staff in terms of difficulty. And I find that with a lot of students, at first they either get it or they don't. Like it clicks for some of them immediately, and others we have to work a little bit harder on it, or just pivot to something else entirely. I've definitely given up a couple of times trying to teach polyrhythms to my more intermediate students, and just change the repertoire entirely.
Just avoid the polyrhythms.
Yeah, and I'm not proud of that because I believe everyone can learn it somehow. But I find like one of the easiest approaches, at least going back to 3 against 2, there's the not difficult, right? And if they're not getting that, which is kind of more verbal, linguistic, all of that, I literally just have them tap both hands at once on the keyboard lid. I'm having a hard time getting my phone into position for this, but like this. And then I have them do this, which is just buck, buck, buck. So both 1, 1, 1, both right, left, right, both right, left, right.
So breaking it down into 2 parts.
Yes, because everyone can do right, left, right, assuming they're kindergarten and up, and everyone can do both at once. So it's just a matter of putting them together. So that's usually my last resort, is just breaking it down. And I find that not even just with rhythm, but with other things too, the kinesthetic approach seems to be just the catch-all approach to teaching any difficult concept if the other 2 have failed. It's like my last resort, Hail Mary, but also it's so effective with all these concepts, not even just rhythm.
I wonder, I've spoken about how much I believe in preparation stage learning, and I used to struggle with my students learning eighth notes, because that was back before I did the preparation stage learning. I would just turn the page, I would do a brief explanation, I would demonstrate it, and then I'd ask them to do it, and then they'd bring it back in a week and it'd be awful. But now I have a multi-week preparation lesson plan that I do, and by the time they get to them in their book, they are fluent and they don't struggle with it. They're not even aware that it's something that students often have struggles with. I wonder if there is a way to devise a preparation stage lesson plan for polyrhythms. There's got to be. All right. How do we break down the polyrhythm into preparation stage, right? Because the first thing you're supposed to do with preparation stage is that they're supposed to hear it. Then they need to do it, and then they see it. So hearing it is easy. You can demonstrate it, and that's simple enough, right? Um, Doing would be as simple as them clapping back the same thing that you just did, right? Clapping back the same thing that you just did. It could be, you know, just clapping it, and then you can take it a step further and separate it out into the two hands with tapping it, before finally showing it to them. I don't know why I I don't want to say exclude, but I almost put polyrhythms in its own category. And I'm like, well, this you just can't prepare it. It's too hard. But I don't think that that's true.
Um, yeah, I mean, they're definitely different than your average rhythms. Like we can teach syncopation, no problem, because it's so easy to explain the theory behind syncopation. All it is that you place more emphasis on the weak beats than you normally would, right? And it's so easy to teach different time signatures, different rhythms that are just made up of note values that are discrete. I think the thing with polyrhythms is because occasionally we have playing that's not necessarily particularly stronger, but it does occur on like an and we have to calculate that to a certain extent. I think that makes the teaching of polyrhythms somewhat layered. So I would say as far as application goes, it's easier for a student to apply a polyrhythm using muscle memory and whatever than necessarily evaluate a polyrhythm. So in the stages of learning, the Bloom's taxonomy, I am kind of satisfied if my students who want to, do a relatively complex piece for a recital or something are still kind of in the bottom half of that learning pyramid. As long as they know how to reproduce the sound on the keyboard for the purposes of performing, that's fine for me. And if they don't know how to explain it mathematically or independently come up with a new polyrhythm on their own based on what they already know about polyrhythms, like can they extrapolate 3 against 4 using their knowledge of 3 against 2 by doubling, one hand? Like, I'm not asking them to do that. And so I think that makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I agree. Polyrhythms, they are so esoteric and they're so advanced that they require a level of independence between the hands that is, I mean, there's just technical ability there. Like you can't, a student might be able to tap it or clap it, but having a student play it on the piano is just a whole nother matter. So because it's so far uh, into piano lessons that they're even broached, I think that there's a big lack of experience with them, which makes me nervous to even go near them. It makes me nervous to even attempt to go over it with a student because it is something that I feel so inexperienced with. And I tell my students that when there's something that's hard and that we don't understand, we don't run from it. We run towards it. We have to figure it out and understand it. I wonder if I could try to get over my anxiety about teaching polyrhythms if I try to introduce it, but introduce it at an earlier stage so that I can become more experienced with teaching it. But I think it might be of limited usefulness if they're not going to see it in there, if it's not going to be expressed in their repertoire, right?
Yeah, I mean, it surfaces in late intermediate and early advanced repertoire, to my knowledge, and it works out for students who reach that point in their piano journey, which is hopefully most of our students, ideally. It's I think it is useful and it's fascinating to me personally, which is why I like to share it. Not all my students have that same view of that, and I understand, but using scales, and I just want to go back and correct myself. If you do a left hand 5-finger scale and a right hand octave scale, it's not going to line up perfectly so that when you hit G, actually when you hit G in your left hand, you hit B in your right. So it doesn't really line up perfectly, I think, unless, I don't know. But I think that if you practice polyrhythms right off the bat using scales, it's going to be a nightmare. So I like to just pick one key per hand to like repetitively plunk on.
That's basically a step up from tapping it.
Yeah, it's basically tapping,
You
but
know
just
what
on
would
a
be
key.
an interesting thought experiment? Like eighth notes are taught in method books and they have cued activities attached to them, and triplets are taught in method books and they have theory pages that go along with them. What would a theory page targeted at an 11-year-old that would be explaining a polyrhythm? What would that look like? What activities would be attached to a theory book explaining a polyrhythm to an 11-year-old instead of an older child?
Well, if we look at Faber, this kind of goes back to your counting, what you were talking about with counting. Faber likes to do that mixed approach to counting, where if it's a discrete quarter beat, like a quarter note, they'll just put the number. But then if we're in eighth note mode, they'll put the number and the and. I would just say, pick a color for one voice and a color for another voice. So let's go red and blue because they're easily distinguishable. I guess unless you're colorblind, I don't know. And I would say they would probably, if they could just line up the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in that sort of space proportional way that they do, where they give an entire beat a little extra room on the page, and then 2 and is fit in that same amount of space, and then they have 3, 1, 2, and 3, and they put that in red. Then the other one is in blue, 1, 2, and 3 just below it, so they're right on top of each other, stacked. What you could do is circle when each hand plays. So both the ones would be circled in a big oval, in the first part. And then for the red one that's counting triplets above, you'd circle the number 2, and then you'd circle the number 3.
Are you familiar with the I'm going to probably butcher the name, the Kodali method?
Yeah.
That rhythmic method?
Yeah.
I wonder if an approach like that would be useful. Teach 3 different syllables, one for the unison of both hands, and then one for right hand and one for left hand.
Yeah, I think the Kodai method, it would just be ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. And so, yeah, you could circle whatever was relevant in each row. And you could use the notes even if you wanted to. You could use note values instead of numbers, just whatever works. And then they could read it out. And I think that could be a decent activity where you don't have to really address fractions. Anyway, 11-year-olds know about fractions as it is. That's one way to do it. Another one could be, coloring in a sectioned off rectangle or something. Or drawing the dividing lines in the proper place to cut one rectangle perfectly in half and another into perfect thirds. I don't know. These are just some ideas.
That's interesting. No, I think it's interesting because first of all, I think all of these activities would be useful for students of all ages as well. I think that all of these would be useful for students of all ages, because this is all about that they're manipulating the information that they know And if I present, I mean, a rectangle, and then I ask, to roughly or precisely give them a graph or whatever to draw lines indicating when which note goes where, I think that would force even my adult student we're working through the C sharp minor nocturne, and I chose that because it would force us both to address her her threes versus twos, as well as 35 against 4 and all of the craziness at the end. But I think that I wanted to make sure that I would address this. So I think that having her manipulate the knowledge of polyrhythms in that way, because I don't know if she could. And that's a failing on my part, right? I think that's a failing on my part. I don't know if she would be able to do the rectangle activity.
Well, okay. So that's basically that's a foundational exercise. Once you get to the level where you're effectively playing Chopin nocturnes and things like that, I think it's important that our listeners know that we as piano teachers that are responsible, we have kind of an obligation to let our students know that after a certain point, after a certain level in your piano journey, the composers are not going to necessarily want you to be a stickler about technically being right on the dot.
Right.
So you can kind of use you could do it a little bit rubato when it comes to polyrhythms in Chopin. And
I think, sorry, go ahead.
And other composers like that who are, especially the ones who are composing like 18th through 21st century works.
I think that's I mean, when's the earliest point where polyrhythms make an appearance in keyboard literature? What's the earliest? I mean,
I don't know.
I've never come across polyrhythms in Baroque music, and I mean, I think late classical, maybe, classical, certainly romantic, but I think that when I was talking about the fluency with polyrhythms, it is towards that advanced literature where they're really just looking for something that sounds like a triplet in the right hand and something that sounds like a pair of eighth notes in the left hand, and there's wiggle room in there, right? It can't be, it needs to be rubato, not robotic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It needs to
That's
have
fantastic.
it needs to have a freedom to it.
Yeah, I got to use that later. Rubato,
Not robotic. Yeah. I think that's that's when you know that a student has really gotten it, when it stops being not difficult, and it instead feels like you have triplets in the right hand and you have eighth notes in the left hand, and you have the voicing really nice so that the melody is coming through and it's not sounding like you have two voices. You have left hand harmony, right hand melody, and then you have polyrhythm, one mono voice, and then you go back to having two voices after that. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So at that point, but the thing is, I don't know if I would want to put the cart before the horse. I wouldn't want to teach someone like a complex piece of repertoire that requires that more analytic backstory and background knowledge about the nature of polyrhythm performance before the student knows how to do a perfect polyrhythm on the keyboard that is precise.
Yeah, I think that I need to with my student, I think that I need to not step away from it, but in addition to the Chopin I think that I should perhaps do one of those scale exercises They've experienced polyrhythms, they've gotten them correct, but they don't have the muscle memory behind it. And I think that doing a simple scale, E major, 3 octaves right hand, or whatever the ratios work out to be. I know there is a ratio where one hand does a larger scale and they end up back on tonic together. I think it's 3 octaves and 2 octaves. But regardless, I think that that would be a valuable exercise. I feel like teachers, we hate talking about our weaknesses. We hate talking about our weaknesses outside of an educational, like a university setting. Once we get more into the professional world, we don't like to seem stupid. So when we to reveal something like, yeah, this is really difficult to teach. I really don't trust myself to teach polyrhythms. And I feel like I've never really had the opportunity to really succeed. I've never had that aha moment when everything falls into place. It's a moment of like, oh, thank God, finally, I've been banging my head against this for weeks. Now I finally got it. That's my success with polyrhythms.
I feel like a lot of it has to come from the student and their own motivation to learn whatever it is that they need to learn that includes polyrhythms. So, like, if I don't know how this would happen, but like, if I'm teaching a student Clair de Lune and their heart is not in it, they're never going to get that passage, the E major, that part. It has to come from here. I feel like the student really has to want to understand polyrhythms in a lot of cases in order to get it. I've never.
Well, that's why a highly motivating piece like the C sharp minor nocturne can be a very effective motivator.
Yeah. I mean, students push themselves when they are motivated and when they want to know the piece and understand. And if they've heard it and they think it's beautiful and they really want to dive into it, miracles can happen, And so I guess this goes for any concept. Like, if you really want to teach something that you feel you're not the strongest in, you can't go wrong having the student select a piece that they absolutely love already, and then just kind of going off that momentum that they already have.
Yeah, I think that it's often tempting to try to remove a concept entirely from the context of a piece of music. Because, I mean, it's so much simpler to just tap a polyrhythm, right? And if you have them tap a polyrhythm long enough, they'll eventually figure it out. And then you can move on to a piece that uses it. And I think that there's a place for that kind of preparatory learning. But I also think that trying to remove the concepts entirely from the context of a piece is a mistake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is a place for a difficult concept, essentially an etude almost, where you have polyrhythms in just a handful of places, and that's really all they needed, because they have it in I don't know, half a dozen measures in the C sharp minor nocturne, if you don't count the shenanigans at the end with 35 against 4, which is just an entirely different matter. But I think that giving them a highly motivating piece of music, some students are, motivated by fast, flashy stuff. And if they need to get better at their scales, then that is an opportunity for them to realize, hey, the scale practice that I'm doing, there's a point to it, right? There's a point to it. And the same thing for something like polyrhythms, introducing the concept and then giving a piece that has that concept in it, the polyrhythm in it. And it's a famous piece of music. It's a beautiful piece of music. It's something that people have heard before, and then trying to tie the two together.
Absolutely. What else is there to talk about rhythm?
I don't know. I feel like we almost just turned this into a polyrhythm episode. I feel like we just talked about polyrhythms for the last 45 minutes. I feel like we talked briefly about subdivision.
Right.
and about my crazy approach to subdivision.
No, I don't think it's crazy. Actually, I had a very hard time myself growing up learning rhythm until my teacher used your approach. So personally, it really worked out for me when I was learning it. And yet, for some reason, I don't apply that to my own students. Maybe I should.
It's difficult, and that's the thing. It's difficult. There is a lot less room for error, right? If a student does not use the method and they just do beat counting and they don't have the self-awareness, they don't have the I'm forgetting the word. If they don't have the self-awareness to question, is this rhythm right? Do I need to use this practice tool? It's much safer for us to just say, okay, we'll just subdivide the whole dang thing, right? If they don't have the critical thinking or just the drive to question, is this right or not? It's much more foolproof for them. And it is foolproof. You can absolutely subdivide an entire piece of music and you will get to the right answer.
Yeah, no,
But
totally.
it's not really, it's that's results focused, and I try to stay process focused because I want them to know the why and the how. And if they come across an eighth note rhythm, I want them to be able to use their detailed counting to understand it, and then and then move on once they've understood it, instead of just saying, because I feel like it's almost subdividing the entire thing almost feels, if you stay with subdividing it, if you perform something while it's being subdivided, I feel like you're almost admitting defeat. You're saying, I really don't know how to do this, so I'm just going to put this on easy mode, and it's not going to sound as good as a result of that. It's going to kind of be clunky, but I don't know how to hold this whole note long enough any other way.
You know what? I think that goes back to, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the term that you used when you first introduced a preparation stage learning? So the first introduction of the concept, I don't know about you, but on social media, I've been seeing this it's viral in the piano teaching community. It's this viral method of just putting 4 plates down on the floor. Have you seen this? 4 plates down on
No.
the floor, and then you put an apple on one of the plates, and there's a song, a very particular like Chinese song going on in the background. Although I've seen people from Australia to Russia to Europe to the United States use it, and the song just happens to be Chinese. I don't know, maybe it originated there as a method and then spread to the rest of the world. But you sit across from the student, usually a young student, but anyone could do it, I guess. You lay 4 plates down, you put an apple on like the third one, and then you tap your hand on the ground to the beat for each plate until you reach the plate that has the apple, and then you clap for the apple. So it's like tap. So it's like ground, ground, clap, ground. Because the clap is the one with the apple. And then you put 2 apples in the plate, and then it's ground, ground, clap, clap, ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's yeah, absolutely.
And then when it comes to some people even put oranges, and for the orange they do something else that's not even a clap. So it's that could be interpreted as maybe the apple is the right hand and the orange is the left hand, or whatever. And you can put different amounts of apples and oranges in these plates, and the student just kind of intuitively, even if they don't know a word of English or a word of whatever, it's across the language barrier, because it's just, you model it and then they repeat it kinesthetically, and it's visual. And it's hard for the teacher because it's a task. You have to swap out the fruits super fast to get to your next like round. And the music is going pretty fast. I've tried it and I totally sucked at it, to be honest. Like, I could not move the fruits around fast enough to go in time with the music at first, but it took a lot of practice. But that's a decent preparation stage thing to address the complexities of subdividing without having to use language such as, to and or whatever.
Right.
The plate contains the fruit. And so it's like, that's your window of your beat. And however many fruits, it's right there. and we're not thinking about it in terms of strong or weak, which has its pros and cons, right? It goes back to what we were saying about like 1, 2, 3, 4 typically being stronger than their respective ands. But again, that's just a generalization that we have when we're teaching music, and it doesn't allow us to open up our minds as students and think about things like syncopation, where that simply just would not be true. But the
What
fruit
about,
works.
well, you just said 1, 2, 3, 4, and that reminded me of, it's just, it sounds silly, a thumb war. 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a thumb war. There's eighth notes in there, right?
Oh yeah.
That's, and that reminded me, one of the favorite approaches is words, right? Their first piece, actually, it's famous people. Abraham
Yes.
Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, right? So the words,
I wish they put Harriet Tubman in there.
they do. They rewrote the piece. They
Oh,
did it in
nice.
their cultural awareness update, and they took out, I think, Christopher Columbus and replaced him with Harriet Tubman.
Oh, thank
I
goodness.
want to say, I know
was
they,
hoping
I
that would
know they
happen.
updated the piece. I don't know for a fact if it's Harriet Tubman, but I know that they chose better people. I think that there's the two, the taxonomy, being able to replicate it, being able to just essentially parrot it back, or read a word and know the rhythm of the word, right? Relating it to something that they already know. It's a separate level of understanding compared to being able to, for example, explain it to another student, right?
Yeah.
Can you explain eighth notes to another student? Could you explain polyrhythm to another student, right? And we need to ask ourselves, like, what we're content with, and polyrhythms don't need to have the deepest level of, or any rhythm, they don't need to have the deepest level of understanding the first, second, or even the third time that they've been exposed to that rhythm, right? And a preparation stage for eighth notes could be doing some of those words, or the thumb war, 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a thumb war, and trying to figure out where those syllables go. And the reason why the thumb war thing is so good is because they're forced to count in the beginning. They're forced to feel those big beats and literally say the numbers in the rhyme. I think that, like all of the other concepts we talk about on here, preparing your students for it is crucial, because they can have that. I would love to get to that point with polyrhythms where I can prepare them for it, and then it's a seamless aha moment when it all comes together. I wonder if that's possible.
I think so. I mean, yeah, preparation stage is so important. I love being able to be like, like a
Strings behind the
magician,
scenes. Yeah.
and do preparation stage learning where you do an activity that's seemingly completely unrelated to the actual concept at hand, and then magically the next week they just know what to do when you introduce the actual concept.
Absolutely.
I
It's
love
such a good
doing
feeling.
that. Such a good feeling. You feel like a magician. You're like sneaking it in. They get it conceptually without even knowing that they get it. But I was gonna say, oh yeah, I know somebody who, if they're listening to this, they're gonna laugh out loud. But I have really bad memories of this one Christmas song, "Carol of the Bells." And not for any particular reason that's personal, but except for that I just find it too repetitive and annoying. And Christmas is supposed to be a happy time, but it feels like it's in too minor of a key, And so I really don't like Carol of the Bells. But anytime I ever think about 3 against 2 polyrhythms, Carol of the Bells, dun da da dun dun da da da, is always the first thing I think of. And then you can separate it out into the respective voices after the fact. I think that would be one of my strategies for explaining polyrhythms.
Is Carol of the Bells that can't be a polyrhythm, can it?
Totally. So 1, 2, and 3. I mean, yeah.
Isn't that just a dotted 1, 2, 1, 2, 3? Aren't they just quarter 1, 2, 3, ba, da, 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 da. Isn't that just quarter notes and eighth notes? 1 and 2 and 3,
Yeah.
1 and 2 and 3 and.
But if you separate it out, it works.
Suppose that's tweaking the rhythm ever so slightly.
Yeah. Yeah, because technically 1/3 of 100 is 33.33333 recurring. But here, I guess it would be.
I think that
No,
you're
if you,
moving through the da da da. I think you're moving through the end of that rhythm a little bit too fast when it's a polyrhythm. Da 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 dun da 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 dun. I think it's a. I don't know. I don't know. That can't work, can it? That can't. I mean, it makes sense. I hear it, but I'm trying to understand how it makes mathematical sense for
well,
the simple rhythm of the bell carol to turn into a polyrhythm of 3 against 2.
it's so if you think about it with tapping your right and left hand, it's both right, left, right. So now just separate out the right hand. It's gonna be both right, right. So, right, right, right. That's the triplet. And then now left, both left, both left, both the left, both the left. So left, 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 left. It's totally even. So Carol of the Bells works perfectly for the 3 against 2.
I feel like we're blowing this whole thing wide open, Arianne. How has this not been talked about? So you just teach someone Carol of the Bells, and then you teach them the polyrhythm.
Yeah, I mean, I've always done that.
I've never done that.
It
That's-
works pretty well. It
That's
works pretty well.
fascinating. I wonder if it is. First of all, I'm saying this is a great idea, and I'm absolutely going to steal it. I wonder if it's mathematically perfect.
Yeah, you can test it out, or maybe there's a forum online that goes into that. But I mean, I'm just hearing it in my mind and it feels perfect. I don't know if that's good enough for our purposes, but yeah. Because think about it. If you're dividing 100% of something into 3 equal parts, and you're in 3/4 time, let's make it a measure. Let's say you have 3 quarter notes that are all just quarter notes in a measure that's in 3/4 time. That's ta, ta, ta. And then in your left hand, you have 2 like dotted quarter notes. That's ta, da, ta, ta, da, ta. So it totally works out.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And it's ironic because it's my least favorite piece of music like ever. And I still use it to teach this concept, and it's perfect for that purpose. So even though I resent the piece for separate reasons, I do use it a lot. And it's like, okay, I guess sometimes you have to occasionally dive into the things you don't enjoy to effectively teach something.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. um, I think it's interesting because it's essentially just another. It's just another verbal thing, right? It's like the same. It's essentially the same thing as not difficult.
Oh yeah, totally. The thing is, you can say the phrase not difficult different ways. So if someone's just reading about it, they might not know when to start saying the word difficult. Not difficult. Some people might think they read it and they think not difficult. So it's not
Right.
foolproof, but you have to be told not difficult, or you have to have it highlighted or accented at certain points in time. Carol of the Bells, it's auditory, and so it's just different, but it takes all kinds of methods to reinforce an idea. So there's no wrong way to go about it, unless it's technically wrong, of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no, yeah, absolutely. Whatever works. I feel like we just throw the
Yeah.
kitchen sink at polyrhythms, right?
To
We
sum
have
up
this, we
all of
have
our,
this book of things that might work with this particular student, and whatever works.
honestly, that should be our motto as piano teachers. Whatever works.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. But other than polyrhythms and subdividing, anything else about rhythm? Anything else about rhythm for this? I wonder if
I
we should
guess
call this episode polyrhythms and subdividing, or rhythm.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'd say if you want it to be more generalized so that more people like stumble upon the video, that's one thing. And then if you want it to be more specific to truly highlight what we talked about, that's another. So your guess is as good as mine on what we should title it. But I think another last thing I wanted to quickly say is if you're a new piano teacher and you don't have too much experience, and this goes with pitch also, do not assume that a student who doesn't figure it out for a long time is like a hopeless case. Like, if you've tried everything you can try with a certain student regarding rhythm, I think it just means that they need to dance more and they need to be coached more in their kinesthetic experience of rhythm. And when it comes to pitch, if you feel like a student is tone deaf, yeah, there are cases of like really students being totally tone deaf, but like you could try, there are methods you can use to train someone out of what can be misinterpreted as tone deafness. So just don't give up on students who are taking longer than you took to understand things like rhythm, because maybe they just need a little bit more time to process it, or they need a different activity to suddenly to gradually understand it.
Yeah, I think that learning something over time is not a bad thing. Some students struggle with one concept versus another, and I think that we should allow our students the grace and make sure that we, as I'm guilty of it too, we don't want to just throw up our hands and just say, oh well, that's it, it's okay. They don't need to know that.
Yeah.
They don't need to know how to memorize. And I feel like those concepts that are the hardest are the ones that are so important for us to stick with them about, right? Because I mean, I had some teachers when I was a kid that would just throw up their hands and let me use my music during the recitals because I just struggled to memorize my music so much. And I feel like, that's absolutely the wrong approach. I mean, in community college, before I got my undergrad, there were times I was allowed to use my music for juries because I was just so bad at memorization. And then I get to university and I had my audition for memory, and that was a nightmare. And then I was expected to memorize my music before I could even perform them in workshop. But for the first time, I was taught, really taught all of the different ways of doing memorization and figured out a system that worked for me. So don't give up. Don't give up on your students when they struggle with something. Don't give up on don't let your students subdivide forever, right? Don't let them subdivide all the time, because it'll give the results, but they will have deficiencies elsewhere because of that method that we've used. So take the time, do preparation stage, and make sure that your students get to that point where they truly understand what it is that they're doing. Any
Nice.
last
Well said.
thoughts? I think that was my last thought. I think that was my
And
big
I
recap.
had mine I was hopeless at certain things. Actually, it's funny. I leaned too much on memorization. I've said this in podcast past. I overcompensated for my terrible sight reading skills by memorizing things. And then whenever I would transfer to a new piano teacher, just in high school or whatever college, they would always be like, how did you learn this piece when you're just struggling to read this one passage that we're working on? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I hate reading.
Brute force.
So yeah. So every student is different. Every student is going to feel hopeless at some point in some concept that they're doing. Don't let that get you down as a teacher. I mean, you already know from experience that if someone really wants to get it, they'll eventually get it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that about wraps up our discussion of rhythm. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.